Over time, I realized just how miserable I was and how it felt like my life was getting smaller the more I was preoccupied with food and my body. And then over time, came to learn that disordered eating really isn't an either or condition. It's not you have it or you don't. It's really this really big spectrum that can range from the more severe end that we're more familiar with, of the anorexia, bulimia, and its extreme forms, to lower extremes of disordered eating, which is just chronic dieting or being really unsatisfied with your body, thinking about it all the time. And I think, sadly, that lower extreme is so normalized in our society, so we don't think of it as disordered, but I think it is.
Hello there. My name is Helen Garcia. My pronouns are she, her, and you're listening to Yellow Chair Collective, the podcast, a mental health podcast that was started by Yellow Chair Collective, the company I work for. Now, for those of you who don't know, Yellow Chair Collective is a mental health company that specializes in working with Asian American populations, providing therapy and group practice treatment, as well as mental health education. Today, we have the privilege of having Megan Soun on the show. Today, we talk about disordered eating, Megan's journey to unlearning perfectionism and how faith played a role in that, as well as the fact that us therapists aren't perfect and we're still on our own process. So sit back, relax, and I hope this episode is entertaining and fun, and hope to hear you soon. Okay, Megan, welcome to the show. How are you?
Doing great. Thanks for having me.
I'm so excited to have you on because you just have this unique combination of calming presence, but also really supportive. And every time I'm around you, I always feel very supported by you. But I waited until we pressed record so I can tell you that. I wanted to ask you a warm-up question, but if you were to go back 50 years in the past, would you meet your parents? Second question, what would you do with the 50 years of advanced knowledge that you knew moving forward?
Oh my gosh, that's such a hard question.
I know, it's such a thumper, isn't it?
Yeah, I would definitely want to meet my parents. I think I'm so curious about their lives, and they don't always share about their past as much as I wish they would. And so I think it would be really fun to get to see them in a much earlier point of their lives and to get to know that version of them. So I think in terms of that, yes, I would meet my parents.
How old were they in 1973?
My dad was 23. My mom was 19.
Oh, you have older parents.
I do. Yeah, my parents had me a little bit later, and I'm the last of four.
Wow. My dad was only 6 in 1973, and my mom was 5. And so when my friend asked me that question, I was like, I don't think I would want to meet my parents at that age. That's weird.
Yeah.
To
Toddler
meet your dad.
version. Yeah.
What would you want to know about your parents at that age?
I would want to know what their personalities were like, in the sense of, did their personalities evolve to who they are now, or have they always been this way? My guess is it's evolved some. And then I think I would want to know more about what they were thinking about the future, what their hopes and dreams were. I think that was also the time where maybe my dad had just moved to the US, and I don't even think my mom had moved yet. She might have still been in Taiwan. So I think I'd be curious, just maybe for my dad, how the transition had been in immigrating countries. And then for my mom, just, what she was expecting and coming here.
So your parents met in the United States?
Yes, they did.
Were both your parents from Taiwan?
Yeah. And then they both met in grad school.
That's so wild to me, how fates collided in that way. And so follow-up question to that then is, if you were someone from 2023 living in 1973, what would you do with the knowledge that you had?
I think I would invest in Apple.
Oh my gosh, so many people I talked to have said the same thing. The same thing. I said the same thing. I said I would work at McDonald's, pay for rent, and then just invest the rest of my money and just wait it out.
You know exactly where it's headed. I think it would also be fun to bring in the sort of stuff that is more prevalent now of just even mental health awareness and acceptance, more inclusivity, to bring that into another time where maybe people weren't thinking in all these sorts of categories. So that and investing in that.
That and investing in Apple. That would be really cool to like, because back then there was no internet. So I don't think people would know that you were from the past. So you can just like create your own practice.
Yeah. Whoa, that's really trippy.
Yeah. Isn't that wild? You can create a fake con identity.
Oh, yeah.
But just to be clear, we're not con artist people. Anyway.
Yes.
So Megan, one of the reasons I wanted to have you on, and one of the reasons why Linda wanted to have you on, is because you really specialize in like perfectionism and disordered eating. And I wanted to start the show by providing like a really brief overview of who you are as a person, just so we can begin to define terms and kind of unpack what it means for you to be treating clients in this type of scope and practice. And so tell me a little bit about your personal story and what led you to Yellow Chair and becoming a therapist.
Yeah, great question. So I think important details to know. So I was born in the South. I'm from Memphis, Tennessee. You can hear it in the way I say Memphis, Tennessee. I say all the E's like I's. As you can imagine, there weren't many Asian people there. And so I think that was a really formative part of my upbringing, is being Asian in a primarily white and Black context. I also think I've just always been wired to care a lot about what other people think and to try to be cool and popular, especially as a kid. And so I think that combination of wanting so badly to fit in and to be really loved, and also being an only, in a sense, being one of the only Asian people, really was formative in the sense of I spent a lot of my upbringing trying to be like other people and less of like myself, in a sense of I internalized a lot of racism and really tried to distance myself from the Asian parts of me. And so I think that ties in, this is getting out of order a little bit, but that ties into why I eventually wanted to end up at Yellow Cherries. After learning a lot more about race and racism in college and getting to a point where I started to embrace my Asianness more, that's something that drew me to Yellow Cherries, wanting to get to do that work with other people and to get to really support other Asian Americans and hopefully embracing themselves. So I would say one of my emphases in mental health is not just perfectionism or disordered eating, but I think almost all of it can fit under this umbrella of wanting people to accept and honor who they truly are in all parts of what that means.
What did that look like for you in college? Because you said that you began to uncover what race and racism was as a construct in college. And so unpack that for me, how that journey began for you.
Yeah, it began actually with Zen happening my sophomore year. So that sort of drew my attention to racism in a very overt sort of way. And from that experience, I started to learn more about race. But it was really interesting because in the beginning, I got really passionate about racial justice, but it was really primarily in the context of Black and white relations and power dynamics and whatnot. And I remember probably out of the internalized racism, when Asian people would speak up and say things like, me too, or like, what about us? I would almost sort of roll my eyes and think like, we don't really have a say at this table. We're fine. But then over time, learning more and more about race, I started to see that no, our stories really matter too. And we experience racism and it's not to compare or contrast, but it's still, we experience oppression and racism in different forms. And I think one of the challenging aspects is often Asians are excluded from conversations about race when it is set up in a really Black and white framework. So it was sort of through that journey where then I started to focus a little bit more on the Asian experience in America and what racism looked like with Asians. And then over time started to really seek out relationships with other Asians. So for a lot of my life in the beginning, as a result of internalizing racism, I really tried to actively avoid developing connections with other Asian folks, which is so sad and so sad to say, but I think I became a lot more intentional about wanting to seek out those relationships. And through those relationships and connecting with other people and culture, all of that was part of the process of coming to see my Asianness as a really good thing and something that I cherish a lot.
I love how honest you're being about embracing different parts of your identity. Because even as someone like me who's listening to this, who grew up in Los Angeles, I experienced so much of, oh, let me not identify too much into my Filipino culture because I don't want to look like that girl or that person and whatever that means. And I think there's so much beauty in the specificity of your story because I can see myself in different pockets of what you've been through. But like when you talk about identity and you talk about like your Asianness and your fullness of like different layers of who Megan is, I can only speak from my experience. But I found that like it took me time to see myself as myself. And so like define what you started to notice in yourself once you went to college, once Ferguson started happening, once you embraced the Asianness. What did you then begin to see in yourself after that?
That's a good question. I think what I started to see in myself is just the sense that all the parts of me can be good.
Wow. All
And
the parts of me can be good.
yeah.
It's
And
so
it's
good.
really interesting because I forgot that a lot of part of the healing was actually in relation to healing from disordered eating. So again, jumping
Whoa.
ahead, but
That's so
I
cool.
think that is a big piece of the puzzle that I forgot to mention. So just to give some
Before you go on though, for people that are listening to this who might not have struggled with disordered eating, can you define what that looks like even from a mental context? Not because I think that when people think of disordered eating, for example, they think anorexic or bulimic. Can you unpack that for people?
Absolutely. I can actually unpack it in the context of my story. I think it'll give more light to what I mean when I
Perfect.
say disordered eating. So to give some of my own history with it, I growing up never really struggled with food. I loved food. I think I had a really healthy relationship to food and my body. The exception being, so I was totally fine with my body shape and size, never really thought about it. I think the one exception is, again, this ties to the Asianness piece of wanting to distance myself from Asianness and seeing how our beauty norms were so saturated in whiteness, though, of course, as a kid, I had no language for that and just assumed they were objective. And so I think I really tried to distance myself from Asianness. I remember looking up YouTube videos of how to get a double eyelid or how to contour your face so that you have high cheekbones, more narrow nose, things like that. I think that was one piece where I was really concerned with my appearance. But in terms of my body, it was not as big of a thing. But then right before college, my mom with good intentions and innocently said something like, just be careful when you go to college of gaining weight. And so that planted a little seed. And then at the time, I think some of my friends were using the MyFitnessPal app where you track your calories. And so I just decided to get on it and start doing that. But in the beginning, it wasn't really a big deal. It was just almost like seeds were being planted, but I wasn't really struggling that much. But then I got to college, and the way that food worked in my college is it's all buffet style. You can eat as much as you want. And I started to notice it in other people. So I would notice people saying really interesting things about food that I'd never been attuned to before. Things like, oh my gosh, I can't believe I ate that much, or oh, I'm being so bad, or I lack willpower, things like that around what they were eating, and just noticing all the guilt and shame. And so I noticed it on others, but over time, as my freshman year went on, I realized I was right there with them of slowly being in that environment where I think a lot of people were very concerned about food and their bodies, I started to have that same mentality. And then something just ratcheted up and I became very obsessed with thinness. And so that looked like calorie counting, coming up with all these food rules about what to eat, what not to eat. I would try to build motivation by looking up articles on the dangers of sugar and carbs. And I would do exercise I didn't enjoy. It would just be this very consuming thing. And I didn't realize I had a problem at first because of exactly what you were saying, Helen, of when people think of disordered eating, they think of someone with severe anorexia or someone with bulimia who's purging all the time. And I felt like what I was doing was what everyone around me was. So how could it be a problem if it was so quote unquote normal? But then over time, I realized just how miserable I was and how it felt like my life was getting smaller the more I was preoccupied with food and my body. And then over time, came to learn that disordered eating really isn't an either or condition. It's not you have it or you don't. It's really this really big spectrum that can range from the more severe end that we're more familiar with, of the anorexia, bulimia, and its extreme forms, to lower extremes of disordered eating, which is just chronic dieting or being really unsatisfied with your body, thinking about it all the time. And I think, sadly, that lower extreme is so normalized in our society, so we don't think of it as disordered, but I think it is.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it was only recently that I realized that my relationship with food when I was in college as well started to get worse. But like sociologically, when you think about it, when you're around people that think in a certain way, there's a sense of like groupthink that can happen to somebody. And I think that, correct me if I'm wrong, Megan, but it seems like your relationship to food began to change when you were around other people who had similar thoughts, where it sounds like you weren't coming from a family that struggled with that.
Yeah, I think my family didn't really struggle with it, though I do think sometimes my mom would try diets or talk about her weight. And so I think that maybe shaped me a little bit, but in general, I think it was way worse in college where people were very concerned about their appearance, where they were very concerned with gaining weight and how much they were eating. And so I think just being in environments like that where it's so common, again, we often equate what's normal with what's good, when normal have to mean good.
That's so good. Normal doesn't have to mean good. And I hear that a lot of, everyone struggles through this. It's not that big of a deal. And so you said that it wasn't until later that you realized that you started to feel really miserable in your body and your world started to get smaller. When did this like ding moment and recovery moment start to happen for you?
It started to happen maybe midway through my college experience when I again felt so miserable with this constant cycle of waking up thinking about food, thinking about what do I need to eat today? What can I eat? What can I not eat? At the end of the day, feeling like I had failed in many ways, feeling so much guilt, getting to a point where I really hated my body at times and felt like I needed to punish with even more rules and whatnot. It was just so miserable. Took away from so much of life in the sense of life became about this, and it was hard to really be present and enjoy these other things. And so I think as the misery increased, that was where I started to question things a little bit more. And I think too, another piece of it was my faith experience too. And so I identify as a Christian. And I think initially when I was struggling with this stuff, I actually found a lot of ways to allow my faith to justify disordered eating. There's so many different understandings of Christianity, but I leaned pretty hard into the version of Christianity that is against pleasure and indulgence and material things. And so could really use my faith to justify food being a bad thing and my body being a bad thing. And so I used it at first, but then I got to a point where I thought, if this is what faith is, I don't want this sort of God. Like, this God is not the God I want to follow.
Mm.
And it doesn't align with the God I've come to know, one who brings freedom and joy. And so after that, I stumbled across this book called Food and Faith by Norman Wirzba, and it presents a very different understanding of faith, one in which the world is good, food is good, our bodies are good. And that was a really pivotal moment for me, because I think our world is filled with so many arbitrarily constructed hierarchies. We have billions of versions of this.
So good.
But in the realm of our body, I mean, there's a million hierarchies that come to mind immediately. Things like, it's better to be thin than to be bigger. It's better to have white features than Asian black features. It's better to have blue eyes or blonde hair than to be brunette or to have black eyes. All these hierarchies. And so I think my faith was really helpful, because it gave me a new sort of perspective of, what if all those hierarchies are just things we made up and there's no truth to them?
Wow.
And what if there's this other perspective that I can have by faith, that everything is good? These hierarchies we have are destructive and random and false. And so I think that's actually not only how I found healing in part with my disordered eating, but also that was a really important piece in starting to embrace my Asianness too. Because the racism is just another arbitrary, destructive hierarchy. And so I think in the realm of race and ethnicity, this was another place where I started to really live into the belief, the hope that all bodies, all races, all ethnicities are good.
I can't escape from what you said about, like, food is good. Food is good. And that's one statement that you read from Norman Wirzba. It's a beautiful name. I think that there's something so beautiful about words and how words can penetrate our very belief systems if we're open and receptive to it. And I think that, when you speak about faith, oftentimes as therapists, we do a biopsychosocial spiritual assessment. And there's something so beautiful about leaning into the spirit of how you think about food, how you think about joy, how you think about identity, and how food was almost like the beginning of your healing journey of like, let me start to understand my belief around this, where oftentimes when we think about healing, when I've thought about healing in the past, it's always been me, Helen, struggles with perfectionism. Let me try not to do that. Let me just focus on the habit of trying not to be perfect. But you spoke to the hierarchy of it all. Let me see how I think about this thing, and how does this thing affect other systems of my life? And I think that faith really does play a large role in cultivating spirit, because mind is logic. If we really define mind as logic and brain as organ, soul is like emotion, relational health, and our relationship to the world. And I think that when you spoke to that, it's a realm of healing that a lot of people don't talk about. And I'd love for you to speak more to how faith has played a healing role in other areas of your life as well.
Yeah, I think one of the biggest ways that faith plays a healing role for me is what I was talking about. If it gives me a new vision, a new way of seeing.
That's good.
Oftentimes things with, for instance, body image, when I talk to clients about body image stuff, it's really hard because they're not wrong when they say that other people care about this stuff, or other people say value thinness or appearance. It'd be lying for me to say that's not true or people don't care, because it is really true. Our society does often see in this sort of way. And so I think it's crucial to find voices or sources that remind us that maybe there's another way of seeing. There's another way of seeing the world and ourselves. And for me, faith is what gives me new eyes to see. And often the way it allows me to see is to see others and myself as very good.
That's so good. It's like it's more of an identity shift, not a habit shift.
Yeah. Or even a perspective shift of who I
Mm.
am doesn't change, but the perspective changes from rather than placing myself within these arbitrary, destructive hierarchies of the world, it allows me to take myself out and just remember that I'm good. And so is the person across from me or next to me.
That's good. And it creates like a level playing field too, because I think that perfectionist thinking, just from my experience, because I call myself a recovering perfectionist. It's like for me, I've created like hierarchies of, and you spoke to this earlier, Megan, where there was hierarchical thinking of if I am this way, if I achieve this level of thinness, if I achieve this level of body, then I will look like this, or then I will present in this way. And it's so interesting how, in recovery spaces, they always talk about like just surrender to something greater than yourself, be of service to others. Admitting you have a problem is the first step of recovery, and putting a label to it is helpful. But oftentimes, the act of surrender and the openness to different belief systems can create like a new humility that is just so refreshing because it's not up to you anymore. Like it's almost like a surrender, like a hug from someone else.
Yeah, that's a good way of putting it. I like the connection you made between perfectionism and hierarchy because I think very core to perfectionism is constant evaluation of what's good or bad, or am I being good
Wow.
enough, bad enough? And so I think that's why it was so powerful for me in many domains of my life to just trust that I am good, apart from the stuff that I think I need to do in order to be good. It just collapsed that need to earn that goodness by accepting that what if I already am good?
I'm going to share something very interesting about myself because I think that it'll provide leeway into like your healing work and how you got into therapy. But one of the things I started noticing in myself is that I would get obsessed with like, I love audio. And with me, I can get really obsessed with like the latest equipment that comes out or the latest technology. And I can get so hyperfixated with the technology that I forget why I'm doing it and the conversation that I get to have with you or with other people around. Like, I love podcasting and audio because it provides an opportunity to have free access and education for people that might not have it anymore. But like, I love what you said about like, it had really great intentions, disordered eating and perfectionism, because I wanted to belong and I wanted to feel good in my own body. But sometimes we can get hyperfixated with like the act of it that we forget why we do it. And I think that you got to the heart of why, and you started to see like my why can have a different what. And so speak to like how you got into this work as a therapist and how this healing journey plays a role into your work with your clients.
Yeah. So I got into this work as a therapist because I think it really aligns with my personality. I've always been a really curious person. I've always really loved depth in relationships. Those moments where your relationship or your conversation shifts from something that's more surface level, more shallow to all of a sudden deep.
So good.
I'm trying to find a way to describe what it makes me feel. This is very cheesy, but I feel like it makes my heart sing. There's just something that happens in my body when that shift occurs. And so I've just always
Where do you feel that in your body? Like that happiness, that joy?
I think it's in my heart. Yeah. Maybe a little bit all over. It's just very good feeling. And so I've always loved that. And then I think earlier in my 20s started to be really unsure about what I wanted to do as a career. And so I think two things really pushed me towards therapy. One is that I took a bunch of quizzes on what career I should do, and therapy always came up. The other is that at one point I was shadowing a physical therapist to see if that should be the route I take. And I remember this moment where I was watching the physical therapist do do her work with her client. And I just kept wanting to ask the client how they were doing emotionally. I really wanted to know how this experience was for them on an emotional level. And so from that moment on, I was like, maybe I shouldn't do physical therapy. Maybe I should do mental health therapy. And so those are some of the defining moments that led me to this field. And then you asked how my own healing journey has really shaped my work as a therapist. What's interesting in becoming a therapist, that's actually one of the places where I struggled the most with perfectionism. So disordered eating was another one, but growing up, perfectionism kind of worked in a way because I mainly applied it towards school, and school came easily for me, and so it worked. With disordered eating, it worked less because the more I found I would try to restrict or create rules, my body would just naturally want to break those things because we are wired to eat. And so it worked a little bit less there. But I think one of the hardest areas in my life where I really started to just see how devastating perfectionism can be was when I became a therapist. Because for the first time in my life, there was no rubric or clarity on even what good therapy is to a degree. So it's almost more like an art than a science, where there's a million different understandings of what it means to be a good therapist or to do good therapy. It's not like school where you know exactly how you'll be graded. You'll get a grade. Don't get a grade in therapy. And so that lack of clarity drove me crazy because I didn't know how I was doing. And so my assumption was always that I was doing it wrong.
Whoa.
Yeah.
That's pretty wild to me because so the lack of clarity didn't allow you to feel safe, like the lack of structure.
Mm-hmm.
Do you think it comes from the way that you were raised in school of like you always got a grade, you always got a rubric, you always got an evaluation, some feedback?
Yeah.
Is that where it comes from, or is that innate?
I think it's both.
Okay.
I think I really loved that in school because, again, I was lucky. School came easily for me. And so it was a good thing to get those grades back and to get that sort of validation of knowing where I stood in terms of numbers, which felt objective. We could probably do that, but they felt very objective. And then I think another piece is I just love control. And so that was another really hard part of perfectionism as a therapist because there's so little control you have as a therapist. You meet with your client once a week, sometimes every other week.
Yeah.
And so when you're a perfectionist, you put all the outcome on you. You assume it's all up to you, but that's just not true to the reality of what we're doing. We're working with clients with whom we are just one tiny piece in their life. There's so much else going on, so many contributing factors to their struggling or to their well-being. And so I think it was a really bad combination to put all this pressure on myself to be the one to help the client with their problem, when in reality, I just play one small role.
I struggle with that too, Megan. You're not alone. You already know that. I always, sorry, what were you going to say?
Glad it's just not just me.
No, it's not. I think that like when you think about therapy, when I was first starting out as a therapist, I would work at a coffee shop and there was a clear physical boundary between me and the customer where I was just serving them coffee, but their experience with the coffee was their own. And I got into coffee because I loved the human relationship behind it. And then when I became a therapist, similar to what you were talking about, there was no like physical boundary. I was in the same room with a client. If you're doing Zoom calls, it's like one-on-one sessions. And oftentimes there is a vulnerability that happens in the space and in the room. And there's a concept called countertransference where sometimes the therapist can feel the burden or the feeling of dis-ease in the client, and we tend to take on the responsibility. And so how did you get out of that space of, I'm in charge of your life? You're not in, you know what I mean?
A little bit of a similar process to what's prompted my healing with disordered eating of I became so miserable with
Mm.
embracing this perfectionism as a therapist and all the pressure I placed on myself. I became really miserable to a point where I didn't really like being a therapist. It didn't feel like sustainable. I wasn't sure if I'd be able to keep doing it. And I had just started. And so that was concerning. But I think the misery prompted me to start to want to do something different.
Yeah.
So there are a lot of things that helped me get out of it. Two things that come to mind immediately. One is doing my own work and with a therapist and getting to be on the other side of the room. My therapist, Grace, she is amazing, phenomenal therapist, but she wasn't a magician. And so it was really good for me to be on the other side and remember, wow, even with this therapist who's clearly wonderful at her job, I still might have the same struggle next week, or my struggle might
Wow.
not go away immediately. And so I think that was really, really good for me to experience. And then the other thing that I did that was really helpful, I actually have this sheet here because I used to keep it by my desk. But basically, I wrote this sheet where on the top I have perfect therapist, and then I have all these markers of what I expect of myself as a perfect therapist. And they're crazy. Things like, I need to know the perfect thing to do and to say at all times. I
Wow.
need to be equally effective with every client in every session. I need to be the finished product now. I need to embody every possible strength a therapist could have and no weakness. So that's sort of the top. And then the bottom of the sheet, I put the good enough therapist. And I wrote things like, I accept my limitations. I honor the agency of the client, also to let me know if therapy isn't working. I see the beauty of presence, compassion, and care. I acknowledge the effort I give. And so having this sheet was really helpful because it allowed me to always pinpoint where I was at, what I was acting from. Am I acting from a desire to be the perfect therapist, or am I acting from a place of trusting I'm a good enough therapist? And I think even dividing that page into a top and bottom was just a really clear visual in my head of where do I want to go? Ooh, I'm up here at the top. Let me shift into the bottom.
Megan, thank you for being so vulnerable and showing us the sheet. Thank you so much. Because I think that I've never written it out like that. But when you said, I need to not show weakness, that is so pervasive when it comes to like the toxic productivity culture that I've bought into. And so being able to have a level of honesty with yourself and say, this is what I expect of myself. And it doesn't seem like it's benefiting me to think in this way. And so this is my new standard. And this is my reminder that this is where I am probably going to continue to recover from. And this is where I want to be. That's so beautiful.
Yeah. And I think that to me is creating that sheet was really helpful because it helped me internalize this idea that I think is really important for healing from perfectionism, which is when you're a perfectionist, you have these crazy, impossible standards of yourself that you could never fulfill because they're so high and
Ugh,
literally
yeah, tell me
impossible.
about it.
But you assume there's something wrong with you because you can't fulfill the standard. And so I think healing from perfectionism is being aware of just how crazy the standards are and then realizing that it's the high expectations that are the problem. It's not you.
You're not the problem. It's your high expectations.
Exactly.
That's so good. I want to kind of transition into like what your self-care routine looks like and how you continue to maintain this emotional well-being because we're human and healing is nonlinear, as we say. And so there are going to be times where you fall and there are times when you get back up. And so speak to what self-care looks like for you, Megan.
Yeah. I think it looks like being kinder to myself. So I think that was another really important piece in moving me a little bit more out of perfectionism. I would say not fully there, but I think what helped some was taking a step back and realizing how cruel I was being to myself,
Mm.
how mean my self-talk was. And so I think being kind, it sounds so small, but I don't think it is. And so thinking about sometimes when I'm being hard on myself, what would I say to a friend in this situation, or how can I tap into the compassionate part of myself has been really helpful. Another exercise that I really love that I think has been just very freeing is this exercise. It's called Creating Possibilities. It comes from a psychologist named Kate Truitt. She does a lot of trauma work. And basically, it's very simple, but the whole idea behind it is that our brains sometimes have a hard time with statements that we don't believe. So if you think of affirmations, if you just tell yourself, I'm good, but you really don't believe it, your brain's just going to reject it. The idea of creating possibilities is putting a what if in front of those statements, because our brain can accept possibilities a lot better. And we're so good at what ifs. We ask a lot of negative what ifs normally in our lives. And so just telling myself things like, what if I don't have to be perfect? Or what if I can just be good enough today? Or what if I'm already good enough? Reminding myself of those statements, I think, has opened up the possibility to really start to believe them more. So that's another thing. And then one other thing that comes to mind is with perfectionism, as I've talked about today, whether in the context of disordered eating or trying to be the perfect therapist, it makes your life a lot smaller because you become so concerned about that thing. And so I've tried to flip the script a little bit by making whatever area of my life I'm trying to be perfectionist with, containing it into a smaller box. So for instance, with my job, when I was really struggling with perfectionism, I would do my job, be really stressed after work, and just be thinking about what I could have done better, how I wasn't enough. I would wake up the next morning with dread about my job. All of life was about my job. And so I think my way of tackling that has been, how can I contain this? Whether it's by making sure I'm doing stuff outside of work that I really enjoy, or things that really get my mind off of work, just trying to contain some of those areas of my life and remember that I'm more than my job.
What are some of those things that you like doing outside of work, if you're open to speaking about it?
Great question. I love dancing. I've always loved dancing.
What type of dance?
Yeah, things that, sorry, what did you say?
What type of dance do you like?
So I do hip hop, and I do it, it's like a cardio fitness sort of class, but a little bit more dancey than maybe a pure Zumba class. That's the best way of describing it, but I love it. So getting into my body, I think, is a really good one, whether that's dance or yoga or boxing or walking. I love reading. I think reading is something that slows me down. And then is another thing, in the same way I talked about faith earlier, I think books are a great way to get a new perspective or to hear a new voice. And so reading is great. I like baking, spending time with people. Those are some of the hits.
Yeah, a lot of your self-care habits have to do with being in tune with your physical body. And I think that, like, with a lot of knowledge work, I think we can get so heady about things that can get really toxic and pervasive. And so I love how you do things that kind of allow you to be present in the moment. Cooking is one of my new ones too. My favorite.
Any good dishes you've been cooking?
Oh, any good dishes? My dad makes really great, like, tofu, spinach, like, he doesn't have a name for it, but it's like a dish that my grandpa used to make and that he makes and that I'm learning how to make, and it kind of brings me back to my childhood. And then sometimes I like to make banana bread, which is like classic banana bread. And then I love just like good fish and good rice, just the classics, like the food that I was raised eating growing up. What about you, Megan?
So I prefer baking over cooking. I love to bake. I'm really proud of my biscuits. So being from the South, we have great biscuits in the South, but here in California, a lot harder to come by a good biscuit. So I decided I just need to learn on my own, because I kept going to restaurants and getting the biscuits and they were awful. And so now I make my own biscuits. So that's really one of the things I'm most proud of. But I love baking cookies, and I've started to venture into cakes. So yeah, baking's been really fun.
What's one like Tennessee thing that people in California don't do? That when you moved here, you noticed that, oh, people here aren't the same as back home.
You say hi to strangers when you're walking by them on the street in Tennessee. So I've learned the hard way to not do that. Sometimes on days where I'm brave, I do say hi to strangers and I get mixed responses. Some people say hi, other people don't look at me. So it's really a mixed bag, but in Tennessee, you say it to everyone and it's just a thing.
Yeah, I spent a summer in Maryland and I got into the habit of saying hi, and it's been hard to undo, even though I was only there for like 3 months.
It's a good habit.
It's a good habit. Yeah. Megan, I want to be respectful of your time because I know that you have somewhere else to go after this. But I just want to express gratitude for being vulnerable about your story. It's not easy to come on to a podcast and really be vulnerable about where you were, how you're doing, and how you're continuing to grow. And I really admire the fact that you don't claim to be perfect and you don't claim to be fully recovered from perfectionism, that you're learning to unlearn. And so I think this episode is going to help a lot of people like me personally who've already been benefited from this. So thank you for sharing your resources and everything that you're learning.
Yeah, thanks so much for having me. It was funny because before this, I was starting to prepare and maybe over prepare, and I had to stop talking about perfectionism. So I probably shouldn't try to be perfect on the podcast.
That's so good. Yeah. I've learned to do the opposite. Like, it's important to under prepare for me, but it's all different for everyone.
Yeah, I think that makes sense for podcasts. It's
All
been
right,
so
Megan.
fun. Thanks for having me.
Of course.